is Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, Simin Yud and Simin Chaf. We're going to be learning two simanim today. And again, firstly, an apology, the lateness of the shiurim. Hopefully, we'll be getting back on track. All the shiurims we have the day before. And secondly, if anyone would like to share the schus of a shiur, please reach out. And thirdly, very, very soon, we're finishing all of Hilchos Tzitzis. Very, very exciting. We'll be getting Hilchos Tefillin very shortly. But let's begin. Simin Yatas that the Machaber coins as Zman Birchas Tzitzis, the time of the bracha, particularly on the Tzitzis. And we begin in Sif Aleph, which is based on a Gemara Menachos Daf Mem Beis, the same Gemara we keep on referencing, a machlokes in the Gemara, which you already touched upon. Says the Machaber, Tzitzis chayvas gavro. What is tzitzis? It's an obligation on the person. V'loy chayvas mana, and it's not an obligation on the item. Therefore, shekol zaman sheinoy loivish adalis patami tzitzis. If you're not wearing it, you do not have to put on tzitzis. Of course, there's many different obligations, many different mitzvahs in life, and there are some that are obligations on the person, and some that's obligation on the item. Over here, the Machaber is explaining to us that tzitzis is obligation on the person. So if I have a four-corner garment, there's no problem owning and keeping that four-corner garment until I wear it. Once I wear it, it's a chayvas gavra, then you have to put the tzitzis on it. And therefore, and this is the relevance to our halacha, you don't make a bracha on the creation of the tzitzis. She'ein mitzvah ella b'levi shasai. Because there's no mitzvah in the creating. The creating is the achsher, is the preparatory act of the mitzvah. So you don't make a bracha on that. And this answers the fundamental shayla. Many people, I'm sure, are wondering, when you make tzitzis, do you make a bracha? Seemingly one would think you're creating a mitzvah. The answer is no. The reason being that there's no mitzvah in having the garment with tzitzis. The mitzvah is wearing the tzitzis. And says the Machaber in Tzivez, if you make a talis, if you make a four-cornered garment, for the sake of ta'achrichen, for the sake of a burial shroud, even though you might wear it at times within your own life, still pater, it is pater from tzitzis. So let's see the Mishnah Berurah over here in explaining this halacha of tzitzis, this fundamental idea that tzitzis is a chayvas gavra. So says the Mishnah Berurah in Sivkot and Aleph, it's a chayvas gavra, and it's not v'lo chayvas mana. Ayin le'elsim in Yizayin Sivkot masha kazavti isham pater mi tzitzis, and therefore said, and therefore says the Machaber, if you're not wearing the tzitzis, you are pater from them. Afal gav explains the Mishnah Berurah of Katan Beis. If it says in the Torah, you should put tzitzis on the corners of your garment, and therefore from there one would think that perhaps there is an obligation in the mere creation. Another pasuk says, "Gedilim ta'asachal arba kanvas kisascha asher techaseba." Words that we already honed in on, that when you cover yourself, mashma davka, when you cover yourself with them, and therefore that's where we get this idea that before you're wearing your tzitzis, there is no obligation to make sure the four-corner garment has tzitzis, and therefore you do not make a bracha on this yasat tzitzis on the creation. Ratzalaymer explains Mishnah Berurah of Katan Gimel. Beis atalasan ba'beged, when you hang the strings on the beged. Ela acher kakshem is atev boy mevarich leis atev, when you put on you make the bracha. V'nifsku acher shalav shul, let's say you're ripped, sarch lefashe lasses by tzitzis, you have to take it off and put on new tzitzis. Then you make a new bracha of leis atev when you put it back on. Avshalosh take it, even if you're putting it right back on right away, because it is a new mitzvah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Sivkot and Daled Elub, and actually, I think we already pointed out, a similar halacha is when one's mezuzah falls. We're going to see a comparison to mezuzah in one moment, but a similar comparison, let's just point out that if a mezuzah falls off the wall, not on purpose, when you put it back up, you make a new bracha. Why do you put it back up? Because when it fell down, it was done, the mitzvah's finished. It's a hefsek, hesach hadas, it's a hefsek in the mitzvah. So too over here, when one's tzitzis breaks, now no longer does he have tzitzis. He puts on new strings on that bag, and it's a new bracha when he puts it back on. And we said, when do you make the bracha? He says Mishnah Berurah of Katan Daled Vuatin b'mezuzah. So obviously charged the memory. So too is they did by mezuzah. The kaim len chayvas hadari. When do you have to put on mezuzah? Fundamental shayla, a very ask shayla. When do I have to put a mezuzah on my house, on my apartment, etc. The basic tenet of all of Hilchos Mezuzah is a chayves hadar. It's the obligation of the dwelling. In lavarich al mezuzah rak shu nichlas lager b'avayis tekev umiyad. These words are loaded words in the Mishnah Berurah and the Sig of Hilchos Mezuzah. The Mishnah Berurah says, when do you make a bracha? When you're going to enter in the house right away, that's when you put on the mezuzah. It's right like you're putting on your beged. Just like you hold your talis right before you put on, you make a bracha. So to right before you move in, right before you're going to be dar in that house, you put on the mezuzah. Or you already live there. And this is a very lengthy discussion. We'll just point out, Dirshu in a moment will point out more. But let's just point out there's a difference between Eretz Yisrael and America. Eretz Yisrael, you have an obligation to a mezuzah even if you're there for one night. In America, you have 30 days. But the Mishnah Berurah here is pointing out that the obligation begins right when you're going to live in there. Does that mean that the moment you move in, you're not allowed to put on one moment before nor one moment after? That is the way the Rav Chaim Kanievsky learns this Mishnah Berurah, that even if you move in your items and you move in your stuff, but until you're going to sleep there, maybe there's different ways of learning it. Maybe once you move in your items, you're allowed to put up in mezuzah, you should eat something to create the level of dar of living there. And we'll see the Dirshu in a moment. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Sivkot and Hey, that if you make your talis for the sake of tachrichim, for burial shrouds, you do not have to put on tzitzis. Potter says the Mishnah Berurah, this is going to sheet of the Rosh and you do not put on tzitzis. This is like a nighttime garment. Because you're potter when one is no longer with us. Avol, who argued on the Rosh, the fundamental machlekes is wearing tzitzis at night of the Rambam. Because we are not sure if we pass like the Rosh of the Rambam. That was the reason why we said at nighttime one certainly should wear a tzitzis. You don't make a bracha, but you wear them similarly with the tachrich and the burial shrouds. You put tzitzis on without a bracha. If you're putting on a garment, a talis perhaps, to show it to someone how it looks, or to measure the size of the beged on a person, and you let it try on. You go to a store and you want to try on a talis, you let it try it on, even if there's no tzitzis on it, even though it's a four-corner garment. But if you're doing it because of tax reasons, maybe it's going to be different. Even though it is getting late, let's take a moment and let's look at some Dirshu. So Dirshu note number 1 points out, are you allowed to fix tzitzis while you are wearing it? And he quotes that we previously learned in Siman Yebez, you're not allowed to. And the Machzor Shekel explains that the reason is because it's considered that it's a bittul of the asay, and therefore you're allowed to wear it and, the opposite. Even though one might think you're allowed to fix it when you're upon it, while you're wearing it, you're not allowed to, because the Magen Avraham says that's only a din daraisa. But midrabanan, you're not allowed to, and that's the reason why you have to take off the garment, fix the tzitzis, and then put it back on. And Rav Chaim Kanievsky is not sure. Interesting, if the whole reason perhaps is cause of maris ayin. You make a bracha when you put it back on. Okay, let's leave that. It's going back, a reminder of what we learned in Siman Ches. If you put it on, then the tzitzis were apostle, etc. Mishnah Berurah said the same thing is by mezuzah. So it says Dirshu note number 3 over here. If you do not live in the house, as we pointed out, but you put your items in, which often is the case, you moved in your furniture, etc. So this is Rav Chaim Kanievsky that says you're allowed to make a bracha, and he says from our Mishnah Berurah, and Chazon Ish says, I think there's a bit of a discussion. I didn't get a chance to look it up. I think there's a discussion over there that perhaps you should eat while you move in the items. Not just moving in the items enough, but again, that is a large sugya in Hilchos Mezuzah. There are those that are learning that the mere moving in the item, and the reason is because then your house is storing your items, that's a usage of the dira, therefore you can even make a bracha on the mezuzah when you just move the items in the house even before you actually live there. Then he quotes another halacha mezuzah, let's leave it. And number 5 over here in the Dirshu, he points out that we pass like Rav Shimon Davar Shimon Miskaven is mutter, and that's the reason if you're trying on this talis, you're showing the talis to someone else, it's not a problem, even if it does not have tzitzis, because you're not having kavana to wear it. Now let's say you're putting on a talis to show someone else how to put on the talis. The Sefer Oid Yosef Chai points out that even if there are no tzitzis, you're allowed to do it. But if there are tzitzis, then asla levarich, you don't make a bracha on this. Is, if anyone remembers, we did the tzitzis demonstration that day. We did not make a bracha on it. First of all, I think it might have been night when we recorded that year. But secondly, we're seeing over here, if you're just doing it to show someone else, you do not make a bracha on it. Let's go strong into Simin Chaf. Says in the Machaber, Dine lekichas umechiras talis. Now we're going to learn about buying and selling of the talis. Says in the Mishnah Berurah, says the Machaber, Halokech talis mitzu yeses mi Yisrael. If someone buys a talis with tzitzis on it from a Jew, or mitagar ein a Yehudi, or he buys it from a merchant who is not Jewish, but he says, v'aimer shalachan mi Yisrael. Neman, he bought it, he says, it has a hechsher on it, kosher, it is kosher. They came on the tagaru, since he is a merchant, chazaka shalachan mi Yisrael, he has a chazaka, v'lamar nafshei, he wouldn't lie, he wouldn't ruin his business by selling you false goods. If you just meet some guy in the street and he wants to sell you tzitzis and he says, oh, by the way, these were made by a Jew, that's possible. You don't know. We know there's many dinim. As we learned about the spinning and the tying and everything of the tzitzis, has to be lishma, has to be kavana, etc. And similarly, you can't just buy it from a guy. But if it's a tagar, that he has the svara of mara nafsheh, you would never do such a thing to ruin his reputation, then you are, yes, allowed to buy from him. So says Mishnah Berurah over here, Yisrael, Afilu ein makaro, so you don't know who this Jew necessarily is, kosher v'nem, when you let to buy from him. Afilu achi talino destam Yisrael b'ches is kosher, every Jew has a cheskes kashrus, who bevadei tvan v'shazar and utlan nishman, they made the tzitzis b'kashrus. Im loishu chasher, unless he's Yisrael, that's a chasher, you suspect he doesn't know what he's doing. If not for that, you can buy from him. Uklali achasher ein yardei simin kof yotes. Oimi tagar einoi Yehudi. Let's say he doesn't necessarily have a chazaka that he buys a kosher talis. He has a chazaka about other items. He's naman. Excuse me, Dimyitza Badai, if you find that he's a liar, but you would not believe him. So as long as he's a trustworthy merchant, then you're allowed to buy from him. May Israel Naman, because he says he bought it from a Jew that is believed. Just like if a Jew buys from another Jew, the Sheli here is, does he have to buy it from Yisrael Neman? We just said a moment ago that every Yisrael is Neman. So it says over here that maybe Neman is going back. To teach us that we believe his words. You never lie. What's this svara? Very important svara in many halachos. Only this is special than by talis. Because we have an umdin almost. The goyim don't generally make tzitzis. But the strings themselves you cannot buy. Because they make strings all the time and it might not have been lishma. So the garment with the strings on it, that's not a normal item. Back Bisman Mishnah Berurah at least, the guy made, so you could assume it's okay if he says it's okay. But the strings not, and there are those that are making even on the strings. If that's his business, then it is allowed. But if Yisrael Chasha, then his psula shema hu ba'atzvayas tzitzis be'em bag, and maybe he made it. If Kolshkin does lignos b'menu tzitzis, can buy the strings from him. The shamlin etzil lishma might not have been done lishma. V'im kein pashet afilim yirtila atiram be'em bag l'kashem yichalish. You want to take off the tzitzis and put them back on, it's still aser because the strings themselves might not be good. Mata tells mitzias b'shok. We find the talis in the street, then it is kasher v'asal l'shliach. Tzitzis afilu psukin ushuna idei of gilim. You should never send tzitzis with a guy. Im loy b'shnei chaysamais. In that line over there, in loy b'shnei chaysamais is of course the way that we do all our business. I think you could probably even go buy tzitzis on Amazon. What's the reason being? The reason being it's called kshay chaysamais. They have a hechsher on it. Actually, usually has a hologram or other things they cannot be forged, and therefore that ensures the validity of the item that you know what you are purchasing. Says the Machaber in Sif Beis. We'll see a little bit of the Dirshu afterwards. Ein meichern tal mitziyas. You should not sell a talis with tzitzis to a guy. Why? Maybe what might happen, he might walk with the Jew and he might kill him. Interesting chashat. I feel mashkin. Well, not so interesting, unfortunately nowadays. I feel mashkin lahavke talus b'tziyaz levichav masim to give it to him as collateral. You should not do elam kenu lefisha delekel mechashalachi unless it's for a short time, and therefore there is no concern. So says the Mishnah Berurah over here, Sivkot and Zayin, that what's the concern? He says Mishnah Berurah over here, Sivkot and Vav first. Loivdei chavin to a guy, afilu mutar even as a merchant. Ta'amu chashal shvichas damim goyim are suspected to kill. V'kilu arayis and on illicit relations. So it comes out very interesting. Once we learn Sif Beis with Sif Aleph should never have happened. You're buying it from a guy that says he bought it from a Jew, but the Jew should never have sold it from him. But once the guy has it, you're allowed to buy it from him. But the Jew should never have sold to the guy in the first place, because what's the reason? Says the Mechaber in Sifkat Zayin Shema Yislave, because he might accompany the Jew on the journey and kill him. Explains the Mishnah Berurah there's another reason, because of Zinos. We're afraid the guy will use the tzitzis to pay us zaina and say that it came from a Jew. You certainly can't sell to a non-Jewish girl. A very important chayadam. We wrote about this in the Yichud book. That nowadays says the chayadam, we're not worried goyim will kill you. Why not? Because of different laws, caps, etc. There, that chashash still exists. Unless lafishat for a short amount of time, but if you remove the tzitzis, excuse me, went the wrong way. Here it is. Concluding the Mishmur of Alpisha and Sharu and Kavayim, even the holders, and the holders of their mutter, if you limkar tells the Nachri, then you're allowed to sell it to a guy. We're out of time over here. Let's just for one moment, let's see over here. The Dirshu says that even though we're discussing over here the Cheskes Kashrus, because we assume that he did it Lishma, unless he's a Yisrael Chashid, says the Mishnah Berurah, even says Dirshu Nun Amron, on Simon Chaf, even though Maker Adin is kosher, still a ma'adrin b'mitzvah, so rayu to do it in the most appropriate way, that it's all gone lishma, like the Berlacha asked previously, etc. We said you should not send the tzitzis. Tzitzis b'yad Yisrael chasha. It says the kafachayim shemashach. Also, you need the chaysam b'sei chaysam, which of course is what we do. We always ensure that we have this double seal. And then he talks about finding tzitzis, and we'll conclude with note number 4 over here from Chaim Pelagi, the Leiv Chaim, that says the concern that the guy might go with the road on you, chas v'shalom, and murder you. Shamoti tells me, if you find that this is part of the reason when a guy is a bear of tzitzis where he's not a merchant, you should buy it from him, he says, even if it's more than the value, because of the sakana, that he might utilize this item. It sounds like he's going to use it as a bit of a camouflage, that the guy is going to be dressed up like a Jew, and he's going to, try to kill him on the journey. That's the concern over here. That is the concern over here. And therefore says the Mishnah Berurah that what's going on over here is that the Berlacha discussed extensively, we don't have time for that, and says this of Chaim Pelagi, and therefore you should buy it from the guy, you shouldn't leave it in the hands of the guy, because you don't want it to have this item. We'll pick it up tomorrow from Simin Chaf Aleph.